I am Sarah, 29 years old, a logistics captain in the United States Army. On July 23rd of last year, my nose was filled with the smell of glowing embers and humiliation. My sister-in-law, Veronica, swept aside the peach cobbler I'd spent all night kneading to make room for her store-bought pastry box. In the middle of a 40-person feast for the Ashford clan, she smirked. Honestly, Sarah, if you disappeared tomorrow, no one here would even notice. My throat went dry. But the knife that truly pierced my chest wasn't her words. It was the snicker, the huddle of agreement from Trevor, the husband for whom I had torn up a promotion order at the Pentagon and burned through $43,000 in hazard pay just to protect his image. Trevor clicked his tongue, telling me not to take a joke to heart. He didn't know that for a soldier, once the line is crossed, the negotiation ends. Tell me where you are watching this video from, and hit subscribe if you have ever had your dignity stripped away by your own family in exchange for a fake label of affection. The Savannah heat was a thick, wet wool blanket, pushing 100 degrees Fahrenheit without a hint of a breeze from the coast. I stood on the edge of the Ashfords' manicured lawn, the weight of a heavy aluminum baking tray burning into my palms through the thin oven mitts. Inside that tray was a peach cobbler made from scratch, the crust hand-crimped the way my mother taught me back when she was still scrubbing floors for people who looked just like the ones sitting in front of me. I was a captain in the United States Army. I had coordinated supply chains for entire battalions and moved tons of ammunition across hostile territory. Yet here, under the white oak trees of Georgia, I was a ghost in a floral dress. Trevor's laugh was the loudest. It wasn't a roar, it was a sharp, jagged titter that sliced through the humid air, blending perfectly with the expensive clink of ice cubes against Diane's crystal glass. My mother-in-law didn't even look up. None of them did. 40 people dressed in linen and seersucker treated my presence like a piece of lawn furniture that had been moved slightly out of place. I felt a drop of cold sweat slide down the center of my spine. My knuckles turned a stark, bloodless white as I gripped the edge of the tray. Every instinct I had honed in the sand and the motor pools screamed at me to flip the heavy oak table, to watch their $100 bottles of Napa Cabernet stain their pristine white clothes. I didn't. I locked my jaw until it ached. 10 minutes earlier, Veronica had been holding court. She wore a dress so aggressively red it looked like a wound against the green grass. She tossed a $25,000 invoice onto the table like it was a candy wrapper. The down payment for some hollowed-out plantation villa she wanted for her wedding. She was bragging about the logistics, getting the numbers all wrong, overpaying by at least $6,000 because she didn't know how to read a vendor contract. I've managed budgets that would make her head spin. When I quietly offered to look over the fine print for her, to save her the money I knew the Ashfords didn't actually have, she didn't just decline. She curled her lip. She told me I wasn't used to handling this kind of budget. The table erupted. They laughed because they viewed me as the blue-collar girl who got lucky by marrying into their name. They conveniently forgot that the only reason they weren't drowning in debt was the $43,000 of my hazard pay I dumped into Trevor's failing business ventures over the last 3 years. My blood, my sweat, and the dust of a dozen air bases were currently paying for the very wine they were using to toast my insignificance. I didn't cry. Tears are a luxury I stopped carrying years ago. I walked to the end of the long table and set the cobbler down in a corner, far away from the centerpieces. I picked up a glass of sweet tea, the condensation slick against my skin. My spine was a steel rod, perfectly straight, the posture of a commanding officer surveying a battlefield. I didn't look at the food. I looked directly at Veronica, fixing her in my sight like a target at the 300-meter mark. The noise around the table faltered. Just for a second. The air grew heavy. I accept the challenge, I said. My voice was low, clipped, and heavy as a lead pipe. I didn't need to shout. The smirk on her face didn't just fade, it froze, her features stiffening as if she had suddenly realized she was standing downrange. The drive home was a tunnel of silence, broken only by the hum of the SUV's tires on the Savannah asphalt. Trevor had already stripped off his silk tie, tossing it onto the floorboards. He clicked his tongue against his teeth, a sound of feigned disappointment. "It was just a joke, Sarah. he said, staring ahead at the road. You're making the poor girl jumpy. He reached over and patted my thigh, a shallow, dismissive gesture of comfort, the way you'd pat a dog that had growled at the wrong person. I didn't pull away. I didn't say a word. I just watched the streetlights of Savannah flicker across my cheekbones, reflecting in the window glass. My eyes drifted down to the center console. There, tossed carelessly in the cup holder, was Trevor's black credit card. The plastic looked cheap in the dashboard glow. It was the card I'd maxed out my own savings to pay off 6 months ago, just so his father wouldn't find out he was a fraud. A question, sharp and cold as a scalpel, sliced through my mind. When exactly did I let them strip me down to nothing? I looked at the card, then at the man beside me, who couldn't even stand up for the woman who had saved him from bankruptcy. The trad wife trap had snapped shut years ago, but they had forgotten one thing about soldiers. We are trained to escape. As the SUV pulled into our driveway, I realized my marriage wasn't a partnership. It was a hostile occupation, and I was done being the occupied territory. My hand hovered near the cup holder, my fingers grazing the cold plastic of the card. The war was no longer overseas. It was right here, in this car, in this house, and I already knew exactly how to win. The black credit card sat in the SUV's cup holder, vibrating slightly with the hum of the engine. It was matte plastic, sleek and expensive-looking, catching the rhythmic flash of the Savannah streetlights. To anyone else, it was just a piece of financial hardware. To me, it was a trigger. The moment my eyes locked onto it, the scent of expensive leather and Trevor's heavy cologne evaporated. In its place came the suffocating ghost of diesel fumes, dry desert sand, and the metallic tang of machine oil. My mind didn't just wander, it executed a tactical retreat into the ledger of the last 7 years. I remember 2018. We had been married for exactly 4 months. I was standing in our first apartment, holding a thick envelope with the Department of Defense seal. It was a golden ticket, a transfer to the Pentagon, a salary of $52,000 and a clear flight path to Major. I could still hear the crisp sound of that high-grade paper between my fingers. But that night, Trevor didn't pop champagne. He didn't even smile. He took my hands, his palms soft and uncalloused, and told me about the crisis at his family's firm. He said he needed his anchor. He said a real home couldn't survive with a wife 300 miles away. I need you on the home front, Sarah, he whispered. The next morning, the silence in the kitchen was broken by the rhythmic, jagged sound of paper tearing. I did it myself. I shredded that promotion letter into 1,000 white flakes. I traded the Pentagon for a stagnant desk job at the local base, settling for $34,000 a year just to keep his world from tilting. Diane, my mother-in-law, hadn't even looked up from her porcelain teacup when I told her. She just took a slow, deliberate sip, the smell of her Chanel No. 5 clashing with the faint grease still under my fingernails. Now, she said, her voice like cold silk, you are finally learning how to be a real wife. The audit continued. 2019 was the year of the bloody reserve. I had $43,000 in a high-yield savings account. That wasn't inherited wealth or a lucky break. It was hazard pay. It was the price of months spent in bunkers, breathing in dust and jet fuel, shoving dry ramen into my mouth at 3 a.m. because the mess hall was closed. It was blood money, saved for a rainy day. But the storm came in the form of my sister-in-law, Veronica. She had a brilliant idea for a boutique startup. Trevor didn't ask. He pressured. He used the word family like a weapon until I transferred $28,000 into her failing dream. 18 months later, the business vanished. When I asked about the repayment, Veronica just tossed her hair. Why do you even care about the money, Sarah? Trevor takes care of everything anyway. I looked at the dashboard. The odometer clicked forward, marking the miles just as my mind marked the losses. By 2020, the final $15,000 of my savings had evaporated. I found out Trevor had run up a secret debt, terrified that his father, Harrison, would see him as the failure he actually was. I paid it. I wiped the slate clean until my own bank balance flickered with a round, hollow zero. The logistics captain who once managed multi-million-dollar munitions budgets couldn't even afford a new pair of boots without checking the joint account first. Then came the erasure of who I was. Diane decided my wardrobe was too aggressive for the Ashford social circle. She went through my closet while I was at work. My tailored shirts, my minimalist blazers, the clothes that made me feel sharp and capable. All of them ended up in heavy black trash bags. She replaced them with ruffles, floral prints, dresses that made me look like a soft, harmless doll. At the Ashford galas, I was no longer an officer. I was the girl sat at the edge of the table, usually next to Great Uncle Frank, because he was too deaf to realize I had nothing to say to these people. I had become a piece of furniture. Expensive, quiet, and entirely replaceable. The turning point was a Tuesday last December. My old teammate, Jenna, stopped by for a surprise visit. She stood in the middle of that pristine, marble-tiled kitchen, watching me struggle with a lace apron as I tried to figure out a complicated roast. Jenna didn't offer a hug. She didn't offer pity. She just stood there, her eyes burning with a raw, unfiltered anger. "You're shrinking, Sarah," she said, her voice hitting me like a physical blow. "I remember when you walked into a command room and every man in the building held his breath waiting for your orders. Now, you look like you're apologizing for taking up space." I didn't have an answer for her then. I just tightened the strings of my apron until they cut into my waist. But as the SUV rolled into the garage tonight, those words were screaming in my ears. Beside me, Trevor's head rolled back against the leather seat. He began to snore, a wet, rhythmic sound that made my skin crawl. The gentleman facade was gone, replaced by the reality of a man who had built his life on the ruins of mine. The illusion of love was dead. The contracts were void. If you've ever felt yourself shrinking just to fit into someone else's narrow world, hit like and subscribe to stand with me. I need to know I'm not the only one tired of being invisible. Drop a comment with "Load the chamber" if you're ready to stop making excuses for the people who broke you. Your support is the only fuel I need for what comes next. I killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was the silence of a sniper holding their breath. I stepped out of the car, my boots hitting the concrete with a sharp military click. I didn't look back at Trevor. I walked straight into the house, sat down in the darkness of my office, and flipped open my laptop. The light from the screen hit my face, cold and blue. It was time to start the real audit. It was time to go to war. The house was quiet, the kind of heavy, humid stillness that settles over the Georgia low country right before a storm. Upstairs, I could hear the faint, rhythmic whistle of Trevor's breath through the vents. A steady, oblivious sound that told me he was deep in a dream where he was actually as important as he thought he was. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I didn't need them. It was 11 p.m., my personal 0 hour. I sat in the office, the sharp digital glow of the laptop screen turning my skin a pale, ghostly blue. There were no tears, no shaking hands. I moved with the cold, practiced efficiency of a logistics captain preparing for a midnight extraction. The first movement of the mission was digital. My fingers moved across the keys, the mechanical clicks echoing like small, precise hammer strikes in the empty room. I sent the formal request for an immediate duty station transfer to Charleston. I didn't hesitate. Then I pulled up the master spreadsheet. I audited the last 7 years with a transparency that would have terrified a civilian accountant. Every bar tab Trevor couldn't cover, every loan to Veronica that had vanished into thin air, every cent of my hazard pay that had been siphoned off to maintain the Ashfords' crumbling house of cards. I tracked it all, cent by cent, building a fortress of evidence that no Southern lawyer could ever talk his way through. By the time the clock on the wall hit 3 a.m., my back was stiff, but my ledger was bulletproof. I waited. I watched the shadows shift across the floor until the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the blinds. At 6:15 a.m., the heavy rumble of the garage door signaled the next phase. I stood behind the curtain and watched Trevor's SUV back out, his golf clubs rattling in the back. He didn't look back at the house. He didn't even look at the window. He'd spent 7 years looking right through me, and today was no different. I waited exactly 60 seconds after his taillights cleared the neighborhood gate. ensuring he was truly gone before I picked up the phone. "Bring the truck, Jenna. Now," was all I said. She arrived in 10 minutes, her old pickup truck idling roughly in the driveway. We didn't waste breath on small talk. We moved in a blur of synchronized motion. I wasn't taking the mahogany furniture Diane had forced on me, or the crystal vases, or the silver that felt like lead in my hands. I took my uniforms, my laptop, my service records, and the one framed photo of my parents standing in front of their rusted sedan back home. 7 years of marriage, 7 years of sacrifice, and it all fit into exactly 4 cardboard boxes. The sound of the packing tape ripping through the morning air was jagged and raw, a sound that felt like it was tearing a layer of old, dead skin right off my bones. We loaded them into the truck bed, the rusted tailgate slamming shut with a finality that made my teeth ache. By 11 a.m., the house felt like a hollow shell, an occupied territory that had finally been liberated. Jenna stood guard by the front door, her arms crossed, her eyes scanning the street with the quiet intensity of a soldier pulling security. I sat at the kitchen island, the white marble freezing cold against my forearms. One last calculation. The joint account sat at exactly $47,200. My fingers didn't tremble as I executed the transfer. $23,600, exactly 50%, moved into a fresh account in my name alone. Not a penny more, not a penny less. Then I pulled out my checkbook and wrote a check for $1,850, covering the utilities, the lawn crew, and the trash service for the next month. I left it there on the counter. The enemy cannot call you a thief when you are more honest than they ever were. The clock hit 2:30 p.m. It was time to withdraw. I stood in that pristine marble and chrome kitchen one last time, looking at the life I was leaving behind. I laid 3 items on the island, arranged with military precision. First, a yellow sticky note with a message that allowed no room for negotiation. "My lawyer will contact you. Do not call." Next to it, I placed a receipt from the bakery where I'd bought the peach cobbler crust, with Veronica's exact words about me being invisible, written across the back in thick black Sharpie. Finally, I slid the 2-carat diamond ring off my finger. I let it sit there, cold and meaningless, next to the sink. I didn't want the stone, and I certainly didn't want the name that came with it. I walked out the door and didn't bother locking it. I climbed into the truck next to Jenna, and the engine roared to life, a deep, mechanical growl that finally drowned out the suffocating silence of the Ashfords' world. As we hit the highway and the Savannah skyline began to shrink in the rearview mirror, I rolled the window all the way down. The wind hit my face like a physical blow, hot, humid, and smelling of salt marshes. But for the first time in 7 years, I could actually draw a full breath. The state line blurred past, and the tactical withdrawal was complete. I was starting over with nothing but 4 boxes and a half-empty bank account. But as the miles stretched out behind me, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just surviving. I was free. The bridge out of Savannah felt like the final gate of a prison. I didn't look back. I just drove until the salt marshes turned into the jagged, historic skyline of Charleston. I didn't have a plan, just the 4 boxes in the back and a bank account that felt dangerously light. I ended up in a 500-square-foot studio in a neighborhood where the streetlights hummed too loud and the air smelled like damp concrete and old grease. It was a dump. The floorboards groaned under my boots like they were complaining about my weight. The shower threw out a pathetic stream of lukewarm water that never quite got the grit of the road off my skin. But the air was clean. There was no Diane here to comment on the hem of my skirt. No Trevor to sigh at the back of my head when I didn't smile enough at his business partners. I tucked my uniforms into a closet that smelled of mothballs and pine sol. I set up my laptop on a folding card table. This wasn't a home, it was a bunker, a tactical position. I started working 14-hour shifts, picking up any logistics consulting I could find online, and taking a weekend gig at the Grand Palmetto Hotel. The Grand Palmetto was a beast. Old money, high turnover, and a back of house that was a total disaster. The inventory room looked like a grenade had gone off in a grocery store. I didn't ask for permission, I just started moving. I mapped the supply chain, cut the waste, and reorganized the entire storage system in 48 hours. I slept 4 hours between shifts, my muscles aching, my head swimming in caffeine, and raw determination. On my third day, Catherine Hughes called me into her office. Catherine was 55, had hair like spun steel, and wore a suit that cost more than my first car. She didn't look at my shoes. She looked at the report I'd left on her desk. She threw the paper down and leaned back, her eyes sharp as a hawk's. "Why is a woman with a brain like a tactical computer clearing out my stockroom, Sarah?" she asked. Her voice was gravel and expensive scotch. I stood straight, my heels together, my spine a steel rod. I didn't fidget. "Because where I come from, being noticed meant being a target," I said. Catherine didn't blink. She just nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "In this city, being noticed means getting paid. You're my new operations manager. 58,000 to start. Don't make me regret it." 7 months later, the game changed. Catherine bought the Mariana estate. It was a wreck, a gutted century-old manor on the edge of the Cooper River. Most people saw a ruin. I saw a logistics problem. Catherine had the capital. I had the grit. I didn't stay in my studio. I moved a cot into the construction trailer and lived on that site for 3 straight months. The crews were rough, hard men with calloused hands and a deep suspicion of anyone in a clean shirt. I didn't try to be their friend. I spoke the language of the motor pool. I wanted numbers. I wanted progress. I wanted zero waste. I ran that site like a forward operating base. I was out there at 5 a.m. in muddy work boots, prying damp plaster off the walls with a crowbar when the demo crew ran late. Each swing of the hammer felt like I was smashing a piece of the Ashford's house. Each nail I drove in was a stake in the heart of the woman who'd spent 7 years shrinking to fit into a floral dress. The smell of fresh plaster, the wet, heavy scent of mortar and sawdust, became my perfume. I lived in a layer of fine white dust, my skin gritty, my hair tied back so tight it hurt. But the building started to breathe again. The rot was gone. The foundation was solid. 1 year to the day after I left Savannah, the Mariana estate opened its doors. It was a goddamn masterpiece. The white columns shone under the South Carolina sun, and the grass was a deep, tactical green. Catherine handed me a folder during the opening gala. I didn't even have to open it to know what it was. 30% equity, Catherine said, clinking her glass against mine. "And your new salary is $95,000. You didn't just save the project, Captain. You built an empire out of dirt." I looked out over the lawn. I wasn't the girl in the kitchen anymore. I wasn't the invisible daughter-in-law. I was a partner. I was a player. I'd even started seeing Nathan, an ER doctor who treated a gash on my arm after a mishap with a circular saw. He didn't talk down to me. He didn't ask for permission to speak. He'd sit on my porch and listen to me analyze the hotel's supply chain for hours, his eyes full of genuine respect. He saw the soldier. He saw the builder. I took a sip of my coffee. The heat of it grounded me against the cool evening air. Savannah felt like a different lifetime. The Ashfords were a bad dream I'd finally woken up from. My bank account was full. My name was on the deed. My life was finally my own. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket. A sharp digital ping that cut through the quiet of the riverfront. I pulled it out. My thumb hovered over the screen. It was an email. The sender line made the air in my lungs turn to ice. Veronica Ashford. I stared at the name. The ghost was back. And she wasn't just knocking, she was trying to kick the door down. I gripped the phone until the edges dug into my palm, the old vigilance flooding back through my veins like a cold shot of adrenaline. The peace was over. The war was coming back to my doorstep, and this time, I wasn't the one running. The ping of the notification was the only sound in the office, sharp enough to cut through the hum of the air conditioner. 2:14 a.m. The blue light from the monitor washed over my skin, making the scars on my forearms look like jagged white topographic maps. I reached for my mug. The coffee was black, cold, and had that oily film on top that happens when you forget to drink it for an hour. I took a sip anyway. The bitterness scraped down my throat, grounding me. I clicked the mouse. The cursor hovered over an email from Sylvia, the kind of high-end Savannah wedding planner who usually wouldn't deign to call a new money estate in Charleston unless she was desperate. The subject line was in all caps. Urgent booking request. August 17th. I opened the attachment. My pulse didn't jump. It didn't even stutter. I've looked at casualty reports and munitions manifests with more emotion than I felt looking at that name on the digital page. Client, Veronica Ashford. Fate doesn't just have a sense of humor, it has a grudge. I leaned back, the springs of the chair groaning under me. I didn't need a crystal ball to know why she was knocking on my door. I pulled up the Savannah Morning News on a second tab. I didn't search for weddings, I searched for incidents. There it was. A 3-paragraph blurb buried in the local section. A grease fire in the catering kitchen of the Forsyth Villa 6 weeks before a major event. The place was a charred ruin, and the Ashfords' society wedding of the year was currently a sinking ship. They were scrambling like rats in a flooded cellar, looking for any dry land that could hold 40 people and a mountain of ego. My phone buzzed on the desk. Sylvia, she was calling before I'd even replied. I let it vibrate until it went silent. Then I picked it up. Sylvia, I said, my voice flat, professional, and entirely devoid of warmth. Sarah, thank God, she exhaled. I could hear the frantic tapping of her nails against a desk on the other end. I sent the file. It's an emergency. August 17th. We're losing our minds down here. Tell me Mariana is open. It's open, I said. I looked at the dark trees outside my window, their branches swaying like skeletal hands. We need everything. The lawn, the ballroom, the catering kitchen. I know it's short notice. I know it's a stretch. But the Ashfords, they're a big deal, Sarah. This could put Mariana on the map in Savannah. I stared at the screen. Sylvia didn't know who I was. To her, I was just S. Cole, the miracle worker who had resurrected a dead estate in Charleston. And Veronica? Veronica had no clue she was about to beg for entry into a house built by the woman she'd called invisible only a year ago. A normal woman would have deleted the email. A woman fueled by blind petty rage would have replied with a middle finger. But I'm not a civilian, I'm a logistics captain. And in my world, the first rule of engagement is simple. Never refuse the enemy's ammunition when they're hand-delivering it to your magazine. 18,000, I said. No hesitation, no fluff. For the venue, Sylvia stammered. That's nearly double your standard day rate. Emergency surcharge, I replied, my voice as cold as the coffee in my mug. 18,000, non-refundable deposit due within 24 hours. Take it or leave it. I have 3 other inquiries for that weekend. I didn't have other inquiries, but she didn't need to know that. I'll call the client, she said. She sounded breathless. I hung up. I didn't wait. I opened a new draft and pulled up the standard Mariana estate contract. I didn't hide behind a shell company. I didn't use a fake name. I scrolled to the bottom, to the signature line for the representative of the estate. I typed it out. S. Cole, co-managing director. I sent the contract at 3 a.m. By 9 a.m., my phone pinged. The deposit had cleared. The Ashfords were so blinded by the need to save face, so desperate to keep up the old money facade, that they hadn't even looked at the name beneath the red seal. They just swiped the card. The same money Trevor had siphoned out of my hazard pay, the same funds Diane had used to replace my identity with floral dresses, was now flowing back into my account to pay for the privilege of standing on my grass. I didn't celebrate. I didn't call Jenna to brag. I just walked down to the ballroom. The floor was polished stone, cold enough to feel through the soles of my boots. I stood in the center of the room and looked at the ceiling, at the crystal chandeliers that caught the morning light. For the next 6 weeks, I didn't sabotage a thing. I didn't salt the earth or cut the power lines. I did the opposite. I became the ghost in the machine. I checked the wine inventory 3 times a day. I inspected the light fixtures for dust with a white-gloved hand. I ensured the ice for the cocktail hour was clear, hard, and abundant. The lowest form of revenge is destruction. It's messy, it's loud, it's amateur. The deadliest form of revenge is giving your enemy exactly what they asked for, perfection, and then letting the weight of your actual worth crush their pride into the dirt. I wanted them to see the empire I'd built. I wanted them to realize that while they were playing at being elite, I was the one who owned the ground they walked on. I walked back to my office and sat down at the desk. I took a red Sharpie out of the drawer. I didn't look at the wedding guest list. I didn't look at the menu. I just looked at the calendar. I found August 17th. I drew a thick, heavy circle around the date. 6 weeks. The countdown began. I stood up, my spine cracking, my posture as rigid as a bayonet. I went to the window and watched the sun hit the Cooper River. The water looked like hammered silver. I was ready. The net was cast. All I had to do now was wait for the tide to bring the ship in. I checked the monitor one last time. The contract was signed. The trap was set. "See you soon, Veronica," I whispered to the empty room. I closed the laptop. The silence returned, but this time it felt like a promise. August 17th. 1 year and 3 weeks since a peach cobbler was swept off a table like trash. 1 year and 3 weeks since I was told that if I disappeared, no one would notice. I stood on the executive balcony of the second floor, looking down at the lawn of Mariana Estate. The view was panoramic. A fleet of black Suburbans and polished Lexuses choked the driveway. The Charleston sun was high, turning the Cooper River into a sheet of hammered silver. But inside the house, the air was 68 degrees and smelled of expensive lilies and desperation. I watched the service battalion, my staff, moving with the silent, lethal precision I'd beaten into them over the last 6 months. The glasses were crystal, the linens were starch white. The Ashford wedding was technically perfect. And the best part? They had no idea whose house they were standing in. I leaned against the railing, the cold iron biting into my palms. Below me, in the foyer, the sound of southern drawls drifted up through the vents. I heard Diane. That sharp nasal tone was unmistakable. She was holding court near a $3,000 floral arrangement, her voice dripping with that manufactured grace she used to weaponize. "The owner of this estate," she was saying to some local socialite, "must have an incredible pedigree. You can feel the history in these floors. It's a level of taste you just don't see in the common crowd anymore." I felt a dry, jagged laugh catch in the back of my throat. I didn't let it out. I just checked my watch. 17:45 hours. Time to breach. I stepped away from the railing and caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. I wasn't wearing ruffles. I wasn't wearing the muted floral prints Diane used to shove into my closet to make me look harmless. I was wearing emerald green silk. The dress was heavy, expensive, and tailored with lines so sharp they looked like they could draw blood. My hair was pulled back into a knot so tight it made my eyes look predatory. My spine was a steel rod. I didn't look like a daughter-in-law. I looked like a commanding officer about to conduct a battlefield inspection. I stepped onto the marble stairs, my heels hitting the stone with a rhythmic, metallic click that sounded like a firing squad. I entered the reception hall as the cocktail hour reached its peak. The noise was a dull roar of clinking ice and shallow laughter. I didn't slip in. I didn't try to be invisible. I walked straight into the center of the room, my eyes sweeping the perimeter. Veronica was the first to see me. She was standing near the champagne tower, draped in $50,000 of white lace that couldn't hide the shallowness in her eyes. The silver fork in her hand stopped halfway to her mouth. Her face didn't just turn pale, it went gray. A sickly, ashen color that made her heavy makeup look like a mask. "Sarah?" The name was a choked whisper, but it acted like a kill switch for the room. Trevor, standing right beside her, jerked his head around so fast I heard his neck crack. He was holding a glass of expensive Napa Red. His hand shook. The wine sloshed over the rim, staining the white linen tablecloth in a jagged, bloody Rorschach test. He stared at me, his mouth hanging open, looking every bit the cowardly husband who had let his family tear his wife apart for sport. I didn't stop until I was 3 feet from the central table, right in front of Harrison Ashford. He was the patriarch, the man who thought a checkbook was a substitute for a soul. He stared at me, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of purple. 40 people, the same 40 who had laughed when I was told I was invisible, were now frozen, their glasses suspended in mid-air. "Good evening," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it had the weight of a lead pipe. It cut through the silence and pinned them to their seats. "I'm Sarah Cole. I'm the co-managing director of Mariana Estate. I trust the service has been to your standards." Harrison slammed his hand onto the table, the silver rattling. "What is the meaning of this? This is an outrage. Who do you think you are, showing up here and—" "I think I'm the person you're paying $18,000 for the privilege of standing on this floor, Harrison," I cut him off. My voice was steel, cold and unyielding. "You're in my house now, and in my house, we value commercial transparency. Your daughter is receiving the exact level of service her contract dictated. If you find the ownership unusual, feel free to pack up the cake and leave. But the deposit stays with me." He choked on his own indignation. He looked around the room, searching for the authority he usually carried, but he found nothing. In this room, his name meant nothing. His pedigree was just paper. Here, I held the keys. I held the deed. I held the power. I turned my gaze to Veronica. She was trembling, her hands clutching her silk bouquet so hard the stems were breaking. I stepped closer, entering her personal space, forcing her to look up at me. "You told me once that I should just disappear, Veronica," I said, my voice a low, lethal hum. "You said no one would notice, and you were right. I did disappear. I disappeared from a life where I was treated like a ghost in my own kitchen. I disappeared from a family that siphoned my blood money to pay for your failed dreams." I gestured to the crystal chandeliers, the soaring ceilings, and the fleet of servants waiting for my signal. "And this is what happens when I decide to be seen. Take a good look. This is the budget you said I couldn't handle." I didn't wait for her to cry. I didn't wait for Trevor to find his tongue. I had seen the look in their eyes, the raw, unfiltered realization that they were the ones who were small. They were the ones who were invisible. I turned on my heel, the emerald silk swirling around my legs like a dark tide. I walked out of the hall, my posture perfect, my head held high. Behind me, the silence of the Ashford family was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. It was the sound of a dynasty hitting the floor and shattering into a million pieces. If you've ever waited for the day the truth finally came out, hit like and subscribe to walk this path with me. I want to see the fire in the comments. Drop the word victory. If you've ever silenced a room just by showing up as your true self, your support is the only reason the lights are still on in this house. I didn't look back. I walked straight to my office and closed the door. The war wasn't over, but the first major stronghold had fallen. I sat down in the dark, listening to the muffled sound of my enemies drowning in their own shame. For the first time in 7 years, I didn't feel like a soldier on the run. I felt like a queen on her throne. The reception downstairs was still technically moving, but the soul had been sucked out of it. It was 8 p.m. The music from the live band drifted up to the balcony of the executive office, sounding thin and hollow, like a radio playing in an empty house. I stood there, my hands gripping a glass of ice water, watching the flicker of the fairy lights on the lawn. The Ashfords' guests were still drinking, still pretending the world hadn't just shifted on its axis. But the laughter was jagged. They knew. Everyone knew. Diane found me first. I didn't turn around when I heard the sharp, expensive click of her heels on the hardwood. I didn't need to. The scent of her Chanel No. 5 hit the air like a chemical spill. The woman who had spent 7 years treating me like a stray dog she'd accidentally let into the house was standing 5 feet away. And for the first time in my life, her posture was slumped. The Savannah Queen looked small. "This place," she began, her voice tight and forced. She looked around the office, her eyes skipping over the sleek furniture and the high-tech security monitors. "It's extraordinary, Sarah. Truly. I had no idea you were capable of building something on this scale." I didn't give her the satisfaction of a glance. I kept my eyes on the crystal chandeliers shining in the garden below. "You knew," I said. My voice was flat, a dead calm that seemed to unnerve her more than a shout would have. You knew exactly what I was. You just spent 7 years trying to stomp it out so your son wouldn't look like the failure he is. Diane opened her mouth, a small sharp gasp escaping her perfectly painted lips. She took a step back, her hand fluttering to her throat as if she'd touched a live wire. She didn't have a comeback. There was no polite southern facade left to hide behind. She turned and vanished into the shadows of the hallway, leaving me alone with the humid Georgia night. 10 p.m. The party was winding down, the headlights of luxury SUVs cutting through the dark as the guests fled the scene of the Ashfords' public execution. I was sitting at my desk when the knock came. It wasn't the sharp, entitlement-heavy rap of a man who owned the room. It was tentative, hesitant, weak. "Enter," I said. Trevor walked in. He looked like he'd been dragged through a hedge. His silk tie was pulled loose, his hair was a mess, and his eyes were bloodshot. The smell of fermented red wine and desperation came in with him. He didn't sit. He hovered near the door like he was afraid the floor would swallow him whole. Then, the hoovering started. The classic play from the Narcissist's Handbook. He slumped into the chair opposite my glass desk, burying his face in his hands. "I've started therapy, Sarah," he whispered. His voice was ragged, cracking at the edges. "I've been going for 3 weeks. I've realized everything. The way I treated you. The way I let my family tear you apart. I was a coward. I was gutless." I sat back, my spine pressed against the leather of my chair. I watched him. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel pity. I felt like a commanding officer watching a private who had thrown his rifle into the mud and run for the hills. He wasn't crying because he missed me. He was crying because the woman who used to mop up his messes and pay his debts was now the one holding the keys to the kingdom. "I made a mistake," he choked out, leaning across the desk, his hand reaching for mine. I pulled my hand back, a cold, deliberate movement. "Can we just talk? Can we find a way to make this right? I'll do anything. I'll leave Savannah. We can start over." I looked at him, really looked at him, and all I saw was a ghost. I remembered 2018, the sound of that Pentagon transfer being shredded in our kitchen. I remembered the way he'd smiled as he told me I was his anchor, while he was busy dragging me to the bottom of the ocean. He didn't love me. He loved the safety I provided. He loved having a soldier to guard his fragile, overblown ego. "No, Trevor," I said. The 2 words fell between us like lead weights. "Sarah, please." "Stop," I cut him off. I leaned forward, my elbows on the glass table, my eyes locking onto his. "Your therapy is your business. It's not a get-out-of-jail-free card. You think you can just show up a year later, after you spent my hazard pay and let your sister spit on my name and ask for a reset?" "I was lost," he stammered. "No, you were comfortable," I snapped. "You liked the free ride. You liked the gravy train. But the tracks ended a long time ago." I stood up, my posture rigid, my heels clicking sharply on the floor. I walked to the door and opened it wide. The hallway was empty, the air outside the office cold and silent. "The negotiation is over, Trevor. There isn't a single thing you can say that will make me let you back into my life. We are different people now. I became the person I was always meant to be. And you? You're just a man who lost his best asset." Trevor stood up slowly, his shoulders trembling. He began to cry. Real, ugly sobs. But as I watched him, I knew they weren't for the loss of his wife. They were the tears of a man who realized the bank was closed, the lights were out, and the protection was gone. He stumbled past me into the dark hallway, his footsteps echoing until they faded into nothing. I stepped back into my office and gripped the heavy oak door. I didn't hesitate. I slammed it shut, the sound booming through the quiet estate. It was the sound of a period at the end of a long, miserable sentence. I walked back to my desk and picked up my phone. It was time for the final audit. 11 p.m. The glass of the executive office was thick, reinforced to handle the coastal winds, but it felt cold against my forehead as I looked down at the parking lot. The gala was over. The theater of the Ashfords had finally closed its curtains, and the retreat was in full swing. From this height, the gravel drive looked like a dark vein, and the luxury cars were parasites fleeing a dying host. There was no laughter now. No booming voices filled with the unearned confidence of old money. I watched Harrison Ashford's silver Lincoln Navigator crawl toward the gate. He didn't wait for his driver to open the door. He scrambled inside like the ground beneath his feet was rigged with explosives. Diane was right behind him, her chin tucked into the collar of her wrap, her eyes fixed on the dirt. A year ago, they'd looked at me with a contempt so thick you could have carved it with a knife. Tonight, they were blind. Not because they couldn't see, but because the shame of being served by the woman they'd discarded was a weight they weren't built to carry. They fled into the dark, and I stood in the shadows of my own office, invisible by choice, watching them shrink into nothing. Trevor was the last to leave. His BMW sat idling near the fountain, the red glow of the taillights bleeding into the water like an open wound. He didn't get in right away. He stood by the driver's side door, his head tilted back, looking up at the second-floor windows. I didn't move. I didn't turn on the lights. I stood in the absolute blackness of my kingdom and watched the man I used to call my husband search for a ghost. He looked small, diminished. The tailored suit didn't make him look like a gentleman anymore. It made him look like a child wearing his father's clothes. After a long minute, he finally climbed in, the engine giving a hollow, mechanical whine before the tires crunched over the gravel, and he disappeared through the iron gates. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't empty. My radio hissed on the glass desk behind me, the static a comfort after the hours of polite southern drivel I'd endured. "Lobby is clear, boss," the floor manager's voice crackled. "The last of the catering vans is heading out. Security is locking down the perimeter." I picked up the handset, my thumb resting on the talk button. "Copy that," I said, my voice steady, the professional rasp of a woman who had spent too many nights awake. "Start the walkthrough. Check the ballroom floors and the West Wing restrooms. If there's so much as a scuff on the baseboards or a chip in the marble, I want photos. Use the corporate card Harrison Ashford put on file for the security deposit. Surcharge every single violation. No discounts, no professional courtesy." "Understood. We're on it." I clipped the radio back to my belt and headed for the stairs. I didn't take the elevator. I wanted to feel the building. I wanted to hear the echo of my own boots on the stairs. When I reached the ballroom, the air still smelled like expensive perfume, stale champagne, and the faint, bitter scent of charred wood from the Forsyth fire they'd been running from. My cleaning crew was already moving. The rhythmic swish of brooms on the stone floors was the best music I'd heard all night. I walked through the center of the hall, my eyes scanning the room with the practiced precision of a supply officer. I saw a discarded silk tie draped over a chair, a broken wine glass near the buffet, a pile of linen napkins stained with red sauce. I remembered the BBQ in Savannah. I remembered the grease under my fingernails as I scrubbed Trevor's grill while Veronica laughed about my limitations. I remembered the way my back ached from leaning over a sink that wasn't mine, cleaning up after people who wouldn't even look me in the eye. Now, I was the one walking the floor. My staff was doing the labor, and they were being paid overtime with the Ashfords' money. Every bag of trash we hauled out was a bill I'd send to Harrison. Every hour of scrubbing was a line item on a ledger they'd have to pay. Power isn't about the name on the mailbox or the history of your family tree. Power is about the supply chain. It's about who owns the ground, who owns the time, and who holds the invoice at the end of the night. By 2:30 a.m., the Mariana estate was pristine again. The smell of bleach and lemon oil had replaced the stench of the Ashfords' desperation. I handed the keys to the night security guard and walked out to my car. The river breeze was cold, biting through my silk dress, but it felt honest. I drove back to my studio apartment. It was still the same 500 square feet. It still had the squeaky floorboards and the hum of the streetlights outside. But as I pushed the door open, it didn't feel like a bunker anymore. It felt like a trophy room. I stripped off the emerald dress and threw it over a chair. I stepped into the shower, letting the hot water beat against my shoulders until the tension of the last year finally started to wash down the drain. I didn't think about Trevor's sobbing in my office. I didn't think about Diane's shattered face. I just thought about the quiet. I climbed into bed, the sheets crisp and cool against my skin. For 7 years, my sleep had been a battlefield, full of voices, judgments, and the constant gnawing fear that I was failing a test I never signed up for. Tonight, the world was silent. I closed my eyes and felt the weight of the day settle into my bones. I didn't dream. I didn't wonder about tomorrow. I just slept. I slept the deep, heavy sleep of a soldier who had finished the march, secured the objective, and finally made it home. The war was over, and I was the only one left standing on the field. Monday morning hit Charleston like a cold shot of espresso. No more fairy lights, no more silk dresses, just the gray, humid grind of a city waking up to the smell of salt and diesel. I sat at my desk by 6 in the morning. The office was quiet, save for the rhythmic hum of the server rack in the corner. I did not turn on the overheads. I let the blue glow of the dual monitors wash over me, turning my coffee mug into a jagged shadow. I opened my inbox. Sunday morning had left a lingering trace of the Savannah rot. An email from Veronica Ashford. I did not need to read past the first line to know the play. She was trying to salvage some dignity. She wrote about how lovely everything was, despite the history. It was a classic move. She wanted me to acknowledge her. She wanted a confirmation that we were even, that she still held a piece of my attention. She wanted to believe that her family still mattered to a woman who had just handed them a bill for $18,000. I didn't hesitate. I didn't even open the attachments. My finger hit the delete button. The screen flickered, and she was gone. I would not give a narcissist the oxygen of a reply. In my world, silence is the only language people like her cannot translate into a victory. I cleared my throat, the sound rough in the empty room, and moved to the next objective. I pulled up the Mariana Estate Instagram account. I went through the raw files from the wedding photographer, shots I had secured as part of the venue contract. I did not pick the ones of Veronica smiling. I picked the shots of the architecture. I chose the wide-angle view of the ballroom. The crystal chandeliers reflecting off the polished stone like stars in a dark sky. I chose the shot of the long table, the white linen looking like a fresh sheet of snow. I typed the caption with a steady hand. No insults, no petty jabs. Just the cold, sharp edge of a professional who knew her worth. Mariana Estate is proud to have delivered absolute perfection for the Ashford wedding. We wish the couple a life of seeing each other clearly. I hit post. I knew the Savannah socialites would be dissecting that clearly over their brunch mimosas for the next month. It was a surgical strike. To the world, I was a high-end business owner being gracious. To the Ashfords, I was the woman who had just used their name to brand my empire while reminding them that I saw every cracks in their foundation. By noon, the feedback loop began. My phone did not stop vibrating. It was a dull, persistent buzz against the glass of my desk. The post had gone viral in the low-country circles. The invisible daughter-in-law was now the owner of the most exclusive venue in the state. People who had looked through me at the Ashford Christmas parties were now calling my assistant, desperate for a tour. The Savannah elites are a predictable breed. They follow the scent of power like hounds on a trail. They did not care about the drama. They cared that the Ashfords had been forced to pay a premium to stand on my grass. By Wednesday, my calendar was a sea of red ink. Bookings for next season were full. Corporate retreats, high-stakes weddings, and political fundraisers. I had taken the very people who tried to bury me and used them as the fertilizer for my growth. Success is not just about moving on. It is about making your enemy's failure the cornerstone of your brand. I was finishing a logistics report on the new supply chain for the estate's wine cellar when the door to my office swung open. It did not creak. Catherine Hughes did not do anything that sounded weak. She walked in, her heels striking the floor with the authority of a gavel. She tossed a thick manila folder onto my desk. It landed with a heavy thud, scattering a few loose pens. Catherine leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed over her silk blouse. She had a look on her face that was half respect, half warning. "Engagement is up 30% since you hit send on that post, Sarah," she said. Her voice was like gravel under a luxury tire. "The phones are ringing off the hook in the lobby. We have the Savannah Historical Society asking for a tour. You turned a personal grudge into the most effective PR campaign I have seen in 20 years. I did not smile. I just looked at the folder. It was a tactical necessity, I replied. Catherine walked over and sat in the chair opposite me. She took out a fountain pen, the nib looking like a small silver weapon. She reached for the folder, flipped to the final page of our partnership agreement, and drew a thick black line through the 30% equity mark. Beneath it, in a sharp, jagged script, she wrote 40%. This empire needs a steady hand at the wheel, Catherine said, sliding the paper back to me. You are not an employee anymore, Captain. You are the architect. Sign it. I picked up my pen. I felt the weight of the metal in my hand, the cool reality of the moment. I signed my name, S. Cole, with a stroke that felt like it was cutting through the last of my old life. The ink was dark and permanent. I was no longer the girl who doted on a man who did not love her. I was the woman who owned 40% of a multi-million-dollar estate. I stood up, my posture straight, my shoulders back. The transformation was complete. What is next? Catherine asked, looking at me with a sharp glint in her eyes. Growth, I said. We expand the perimeter. Catherine nodded once and walked out, leaving me in the silence of my victory. I looked out the window at the Cooper River. The water was a deep, restless blue. I felt a sense of peace that had nothing to do with forgiveness. It was the peace of a soldier who had secured the high ground. I reached for my phone to turn it to silent, but a new notification caught my eye. It was not an email. It was a phone call from an unlisted number. I felt a strange prickle at the back of my neck. I hit accept. The voice on the other end was not Trevor. It was not Diane. It was a voice from a life I had buried long before I ever met the Ashfords. A voice that carried the weight of real blood, real history, and a secret that was about to blow the roof off my new empire. Sarah, the voice whispered, it is time to come home. I gripped the phone until the edges bit into my palm. The past was not done with me yet. Friday morning in Charleston. The air was a sharp, biting cold that smelled of salt and marsh mud. I met my mother at the Greyhound station at 8 a.m. She didn't have a town car waiting. She didn't have a designer wrap to shield her from the wind. She wore a frayed coat and a scarf she'd knitted a decade ago. Her hands were the story of my life. They were red, calloused, and etched with the lines of 40 years spent scrubbing the grease off other people's stoves to put me through the academy. I met her at the gate. I didn't say much. I just took her suitcase. We drove back to the Mariana estate in silence. I led her through the lobby, where the rugs were so thick they swallowed the sound of our footsteps like a sponge. We walked past the original crown molding and the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Cooper River. We stopped in front of the executive suite. The heavy oak door stood tall, bearing a polished brass plate that caught the morning light. Sarah Cole, managing director. My mother didn't touch the brass. She didn't even look at the luxury of the room. She just stood there, her breath hitching in the quiet hallway. She turned to me, her fingers reaching up to touch my jawline. Her skin was like worn sandpaper, honest, warm, and real. I saw a single heavy tear track through the fine dust on her cheek. You look like you can finally draw a full breath, Sarah, she whispered. The Ashfords had spent 7 years calling me coarse. They treated me like a faulty piece of equipment that needed overhauling. They wanted me refined, which was just their word for broken. But my mother? She didn't see a project. She saw the soldier who had finally stopped fighting for people who weren't worth the ammunition. My lungs felt open for the first time since I left the army. Noon. The winter sun hit my glass desk, sharp and blinding. My phone buzzed with a LinkedIn notification. A message from Trevor. I stared at the screen for a long time. It felt like looking at a relic from a museum. He wasn't writing from the country club. He told me he'd officially resigned from the family firm. His father had cut the cord, tired of the legal audits I'd triggered and the scandal that wouldn't die. Trevor was moving to Seattle. He was taking an entry-level job at a logistics company in a warehouse. The system I had cracked had finally collapsed under its own weight. Without me to carry the load, The Ashford legacy was just a leaking boat in a storm. Trevor was finally having to learn how to swim in deep water. He was a ghost in Seattle. I didn't feel a sting of regret. I didn't even feel the rush of victory. I just felt clean. I typed 2 words. Good luck. I didn't add a period. I hit send, then I blocked his profile and deleted the entire thread. The tumor was out. The margins were clear. My life was no longer a negotiation with a man who loved his own reflection more than his wife. I was done being an anchor for a sinking ship. I looked at the river and felt nothing but the cold, steady peace of home. Nathan came by at 6 p.m. He was still in his blue hospital scrubs, the faint scent of antiseptic and stale coffee clinging to his skin. He didn't show up with a bouquet of roses or a velvet box meant to buy my silence. He held 2 cups. Gas station coffee. Strong, bitter stuff that gets you through a 20-hour shift. We sat on the back porch of the estate as the moon turned the river into a ribbon of silver. He didn't tell me to hush while he talked over me. He actually listened. He asked me about the overhead costs for the new ballroom wing. He listened as I broke down the supply chain issues for the winter renovation. He watched the way I moved my hands as I mapped out the delivery schedules on a paper napkin. He saw me. He didn't see a pretty accessory to parade at dinner. He saw a strategist. He saw an equal. He saw a person who could hold the line when the world went to hell. That was the only kind of love a soldier like me had any use for. December 2025. The year was bleeding out into the dark. I stood in the center of my office, the heating vents clicking as they fought the damp chill. I looked down at the lawn, the same grass where Veronica had tried to bury me under her wedding decorations. She was right. I was a ghost to them. If I had stayed, I would have dissolved into the paint on their walls until there was nothing left of me but a shadow. But here, I was the storm. You don't negotiate with people who view you as disposable. You don't beg for a seat at their table. You build your own table. You use the hardest wood. You drive the iron nails in yourself. You make it solid. My name is S. Cole. I am finally truly home.